This is the first Sunday of Advent. We await the Lord's presence and we look forward to the Lord entering our world, and the time of expectation starts now. Now, normally on Sundays I put stuff up on the screen behind me. For the Advent time, I don't think I'm going to do that this year. I'm just going to be simple and avoid that this year, and maybe let some of the lighting maybe have its own effect, and not do what we have otherwise done. And there's a time of expectation. I want you to know that if you have a normal time, we encourage you, if you have a time where you get aside with Scripture or have a devotional time, in this front entryway, we have a series, we have a number of books called Born the King. They're devotionals for the Advent season. And if you would like a devotional just to follow day by day, to maybe your personal time with the Lord, please take one of those books. It's a devotional for now through the Christmas season. And so I just wanted you to know that they're out there. We're reading out of Matthew chapter 1. And this is part of a story that you know very well. This is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. His mother Mary, verse 18, was pledged to be married to Joseph. But before they came together, she was found to be with child through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was a righteous man and did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet, the virgin will be with child, and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him, and took Mary home as his wife. There is so much here, and I'm going to try to get into a couple different levels this morning. The first is, what's obvious, I think, to everyone, is what a messy, messy world it was in Palestine in the first century. Israel wanted to be a country that determined its own destiny. Yet here was another year that had passed, another decade that had passed, where Rome was in charge. When Israel came back from its exile, and slowly through dribs and drabs, families at a time, and they started this in about 536 BC, and it sped up a little bit, but it was always rough. It didn't go well. And then in 63 BC, about 60 years before this, there was no fight, there was no war, there was no big battle. Rome just simply marched in and said, by the way, you're part of the Roman Empire now, give us money. And that was their condition. But the Jews were a little proud, and they did not want some foreigner ruling them, and Rome was a little smarter than we give them credit for. And Rome said, here's what we'll do. We'll find a Jewish king, and we'll just install him as king, and we'll say that that king is king over Israel, but of course, we'll direct him, and he'll have to pay us a little bit as well. And so King Herod was installed. And Rome was a powerful ruler. And I don't know that you've heard, but Rome did not rule with grace and mercy and kindness. And the people of Israel were utterly, completely powerless. Now, this you'll understand. Their taxes were too high. They not only paid taxes to Rome, they paid taxes to Herod. It was kind of a double taxation. Rome for the troops, Herod because he liked to build stuff. Now, at least Herod built the Temple Mount. So by the time you get to the first century, literally the Temple Mount was the biggest structure on earth. Now, the Great Wall of China was longer. I'm just talking about it in one spot. It was like over a quarter of a mile long, eighth of a mile wide, perfectly level. All that concrete that they'd poured, which was fairly new. Life was unfair. Their political rulers did not care. It seemed that God had forgotten them. In their literature in Ezekiel, you have the imagery of the glory of the Lord departing the temple, and there was nothing in their literature at the time that even gave a hint that the Lord had returned to inhabit His people, His nation, His temple. They were all waiting for that. And in the time when it seemed like God had forgotten them and everything was lost, you know what happened? God showed up. But in a way they never thought. And in a way no one ever expected. We live in a different kind of mess today. We live in a world that's a mess for different reasons. Now, I get a little upset when people, and there's a lot of people out there who will say, oh, the world's terrible, it's worse than it's ever been, it's getting worse every year, worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And I understand what some people are saying, but let me just ask a couple questions. How many of your friends died of polio, measles, smallpox, whooping cough? A lot of the things that have plagued humanity for centuries, we don't deal with. 150 years ago, if people got the flu in your house, that was serious because chances are someone was going to die from it. No one does that today. Our mess is of a different kind. We live in a world that's too divided. We don't like them, and they do not care for us. We can't wait to get to social media and let our feelings be known. Now, in most of the case, social media is a terrible thing. I was telling someone, in my case, and I deeply apologize, well, kind of not apologize. Last night is one of my favorite times of the year because I got to just hang out in social media for about an hour and a half and enjoy the Facebook pages and all the pages of all my friends in high school that I grew up with because, once again, Ohio State absolutely annihilated Michigan. And so I just watched all the cartoons with Jim Harbaugh come flooding past my screen and loved all of them. That's about the only time of year I find it constructive. And if you're from Michigan, I'm kind of sorry, kind of not sorry. Not sorry at all. You know, once every 20 years, it's okay if you guys win. It's all right. We live in a world that's too divided. And we get the sense, and I think it's correct, that our own political elite don't care either. They don't try to wield absolute power with the ruthlessness and deathly efficiency that Rome did, but they do manipulate things for their own personal gain and not for your gain. And sometimes there's thoughts in life for a whole host of reasons that maybe God has forgotten us as well. And by the way, if you struggle with the idea that God has forgotten you as well, I don't want you to feel guilty about it because Jesus felt that way about the Father. Those feelings are natural. So what's interesting is what's God's response to the mess 2,000 years ago. Sometimes we approach Christmas and we have a similar thought. We think, wait a minute, my life, my schedule is so messed up. God would have no concern with me. I'm unworthy. I'm not like those people over there who have their lives all together and everything's good. I'm unworthy. God would not show up in my world. But like 2,000 years ago, God has decided to redeem this messy world. 2,000 years ago, God did not forget it. God did not leave it alone. And God did, strangely, He did not punish it, which is what some were expecting. We look at our world and we expect, and sometimes we want God to step in and punish someone. Just this week, you saw it in London. There was the guy who went on the stabbing spree on London Bridge. Wade told me yesterday morning I should look at the video. And I did. A bunch of people kind of pinned the guy down. He was laying down on the bridge. Policeman showed up, shot him. And I go, that would be strange. It turned out he had a suicide vest on. It turned out to be a dummy one, a fake one, but they didn't know that. And when I saw that, I thought, oh well, he got what's coming to him. We have those thoughts. God decided to redeem that messy world. God is still in the redemption business today. Look to Isaiah. And even Matthew tried to do this. Matthew said, this took place to fulfill what the prophet, meaning Isaiah, said, the virgin will be with child. Now I'm going to stretch you a little bit. You can say virgin, but probably a better translation of this is, the young woman will be with child. Well, but that's so routine and common. That doesn't specifically talk about Mary. And my answer would be, I think that was one of the points. God is choosing a common, routine route to redeem his world. He didn't come to a palace. He didn't come in halls of power. He came in a most unexpected way, in a most powerless situation. Look at God's answer, and it is so plain that we miss it because we want God to do something. We want God to show up. We want God to make things right, to heal every disease, to make every sad person happy, to make every mean boss nice. We want God to just come in and order everything. But the answer 2,000 years ago was God decided to enter the mess himself and take on all of it. And I think God sometimes, he works in our world by entering our mess as well. 2,000 years ago, God entered that mess at its messiest point. Jesus came through an unlikely person, a not yet married single mom, a powerless young woman from a small town far away from the capital. So not only is it less than perfect, a messy life. I used this word a few years ago, you laughed at me. A cattywampus life is expected and even welcome at Christmas. Your life, however messy you think it is good enough for the Son of God to take up residence. I want you to know that whatever disorder, whatever mess, whatever not perfect is going on in your life does not disqualify anyone from redemption. I imagine Mary was terrified. There was a lot of things going on here, and I think we miss it. Let me just spend a little time with the story. But after he considered this, an angel said, she will give birth to a son, speaking of Joseph, and you will give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Now, here's what we get wrong. In that day, the vast majority of Jews named their children Cephas, Johannes, Judas. Notice their endings are very similar. Jesus was amongst the most common names in the first century. It was not different. It was not unique. It was not special. It was like John. It was like Michael. It was like David. Mary and Joseph were different. There was this small group of Jews, no more than 10% of the population. And they were very devout. I mean, they were the strict, devout, rigid. They were looking for the Messiah to come. They were praying for the Messiah to come. They wanted the Messiah to come. They were looking for it. They were expectant. They breathed that they wanted it so bad. And you know they were different because they named their children completely different from the rest of the culture. They would name their children after some of the patriarchs from Genesis and Exodus. So their children would be called maybe Isaac or Jacob or Joseph. And if they had a daughter, they might be named after, you remember the Moses story, they might have named their daughters Miriam or Mary. And I don't know what name they had planned out for Jesus, but I'm telling you it wasn't Jesus. It was something else. it was one of those patriarchal names. Maybe Isaac, maybe something like that. And so when they come, when the angel's talking to Joseph is, no, I want you to name your child the most common name that's going on right now. And Joseph went, really? Nothing special? I got a humdinger. I got one that no one has ever thought of before. Hamus, Maximilian, whatever, I don't know. I got some strange name and hook them all together. In the middle of the routine, in the middle of the common, is where Jesus is going to redeem his people. Part of the solution, and I'm sure Mary was terrified. All of a sudden Mary shows up, she's pregnant. And I'm sure she knew the whole, wait a minute, trust me, nothing happened. This is an immaculate conception. And I'm sure all the people in her life believed her about the same that we would believe. Someone in our life who said that. There's nothing easy about the task that faces her. She's pregnant. People are talking behind her back. Everybody knows that. Her family has been dishonored. Here's the catch. She was innocent. And no one knew. She knew. Joseph knew. Eventually. There are times in life when we will bear a burden that we did not create. Have you been there? When you're bearing a weight that you had nothing to do with. Your factory closed down. Your company went under. You got the diagnosis early that no one should be facing at that age. You struggle with a child. I'm thinking of the people I know in my life who, I said this when my daughter, when Sarah was pregnant this year, and 2 years ago when Dottie was pregnant. I said this, and I meant, I said, when Michelle was pregnant all those years ago, I never worried. Never once, never a day worried. 9 months, baby come out, everything will be fine. Never worried. You live life a little bit, and you see everything else. When it was my kids going through it, I was worried every day for 9 months. Because you've seen enough stuff not go perfect. And you worry about it. The path to redemption for Mary was to just keep going. Here's the trick. The path for redemption for everybody else that she knew in her world, including you and I who she didn't know, was based on whether she just kept going faithfully anyway. The path to redemption to the people who were talking, the path to redemption for those who are whispering behind her back, was for Mary to just be faithful in the midst of circumstances that she did not create. Often, our way out of the burdens we bear is to just keep going. I know you've heard this one. If you find yourself in the middle of hell, don't stop. Keep walking until you're out. That's literally what Mary's path was. But it wasn't just her, it was also Joseph. Joseph, at the beginning, was looking on this from a distance. He was close to it, but not as intimately involved as Mary was, of course. And it says exactly, because Joseph was a righteous man. Listen to what the text says. It goes, because Joseph was righteous, he was going to keep Mary around. That's not what it says. Because he was righteous, he was going to get rid of her in private. Unlike the unrighteousness who would have made a big spectacle of it and shamed him publicly. I mean, how dare Mary do this to him? He's from an honorable family. And I'm one, I think, I'll give you the authors if you want. I think they've carried the day. Joseph was a Pharisee. Nazareth was a town that was a hotbed of a certain sect of Pharisees. Joseph wanted to advance. He wanted to be a leader. He was a person who wanted to have some kind of notoriety and fame. He wanted to be a person of importance. And he couldn't wait for a son to come because he's going to raise that son to be a Pharisee as well. And Jesus was raised to be a Pharisee. And then Mary shows up, pregnant. And all his hopes were dashed in an instant. How am I politically going to be viewed as important when my family, when my name has just been dragged through the mud? The easy thing for him to do is not to get involved. The easy thing for him would be to leave her alone and get rid of her quietly. And let Mary bear up under the weight of what she did to him by herself. And in his culture, he had every right. In his culture, he had every expectation. In his culture, he would have been applauded for doing the right thing. But the route for Joseph's redemption was to step in and act in behalf of someone else. By the way, again, our redemption, our participation in this was at least in part contingent upon Joseph stepping in behalf of someone else. In order for redemption to happen, sometimes for us, sometimes for a lot of people around us, the people who stand at a distance safely are going to have to get involved. And get involved in other people's lives in ways that might be a little uncomfortable. We might have to step in and bear up part of the load ourselves and get a little messy ourselves. My question is this morning, has this been a tough year? For some of you, I know it has. Some of you, it's been a great year. Here's the good news for those it's been a bad year. It will get better, I guarantee it. Here's the bad news for those of you who are going through a fantastic year. It will get worse, I guarantee it. And those of you that have had a kind of year, I guarantee you, most likely, it'll just kind of stay right here, right in the middle for a lot of the time. The good news is, if you're having a bad year, a return to is pretty good. The average is good. The routine is fantastic. In about the 45 minutes before the worship service began, there were 3 ambulances, 3 fire trucks that went past the front of the church that way. If it's boring, if it's routine, those fire trucks and ambulances have nothing to do with you. That's good news. 4 miles that way, the hospital. That means it has nothing to do with you. Boring and average is good. Let me tell you, regardless of where you are on the graph, there is a God that is working in your behalf. All the time. But you play a role. I'm just wondering, in the midst of the deepest valley, in the midst of things, when things aren't going well, and my encouragement is to just go and stay faithful. The faithfulness is so important. Because you don't know what 20 years from now looks like. You don't know what 30 years from now looks like, 10 years from now looks like. We live in a world, and even a church world, where the emphasis in a lot of places and a lot of time is if you pray enough right now, God's action in your life will be instantaneous and right now. And if you just pray and believe, you'll get your miracle. And we'll put jars up, and if you've had an answer to prayer, we'll put something in to signify you've had an answer to prayer and all that kind of thing. And that's fine, except I'm telling you that most of the time God's action in your life is not that clean and neat and instant. There was stuff that I would have liked to have seen happen 20 years ago, 25 years ago that didn't happen, and I'm wondering what on earth is wrong. Did God fall asleep at the switch? And if I could go back now and maneuver and manipulate everything to get what I was praying for 25 years ago, I wouldn't touch it. Because I've seen what God has done in that time. But it takes faithfulness to see it happen. The people that were praying 2,000 years ago wanted a guy on a horse with troops behind him to make everything right. And it didn't happen. Because God was doing something greater. So here's the 3 things I'd tell you. This year, this Christmas, if it hasn't been the best year, I want you to keep going. I want you to keep going. About 3 years ago, there was a kid in my class who was getting aced everything, had A's in everything. And all of a sudden, there was a class he missed. His grandfather had died, and he went to the funeral. And then he came back, and 2 weeks later, a week later, was the big paper. And don't get me started on the big paper. I've been grading it this week. I'm cranky. And they came back, and he didn't turn it in. And a week later, I said, Jim, would you come up here, please? And he did after class. I said, I don't have your paper. He said, man, I know. I'm just, my grandfather died, and it's just rough. It's kind of bothered me. And I said, Jim, why don't you listen to me? Next week, I want a paper. Whether you turn in a paper or not, your grandfather's still going to be gone. It's going to be worse, though, if you've messed up a semester. I said, I want one next week. I believe in you. You can do this. I want the paper, no excuses. Now, he turned it in. The paper was a D. Would have been better, but he was late. Had to mark it off. But just those points he made enough that year to get an A- in the class because of that. In the middle of whatever rough's going on, I want you to keep going. Don't stop. I want you to be faithful. Sometimes the best thing a Christian can do, and I know you turn on, there's people, the praying Christian is the best Christian. There's nothing wrong with the praying Christian. I love praying Christians. And a whole host of things. Let me tell you what often the best Christian is. The one that wakes up and puts the right foot in front of the left foot. And then puts the left foot in front of the right foot. And does that all day. And then the next day. And maybe does that for 365 days. Because you have no idea what faithfulness can do to a life and to a situation. Second thing I want you to do. Stop and act in behalf of someone else. Stop in someone else's life. Stop when they're with you and just, hey, is God's voice speaking right here? And act in behalf of someone else. There were people that acted in my behalf, and I didn't know it. There are things that I see now at this point of life, and I connect all the dots that I didn't see 30, 40 years ago. And went, oh, I get it. Someone else might be dependent. Their redemption might be dependent on your involvement. But one other thing, you might be dependent on it in a way you don't understand. The person that you absolutely act in behalf of now, 10 years ago, might be the person that steps in for you. In this story, our Christmas story, it is a story of God decisively entering the world, but there was a lot of people that were faithful. A lot of people that had to stay faithful through trying circumstances. Now let me tell, some of you here might be going through trying circumstances, and you haven't told anybody about it. I know some of you are like that. You'll pray for everybody else, but if something happens to you, it's going to be way a long time before you let anybody else know. That's fine. Those of you that have been bearing up under a load, it might be for months, it might be for years. This might have been the worst 15 months, 18 months, the worst 5 years of your life. Those of you that have been bearing up under load, are you listening? Thank you. I know how hard it's been. And I appreciate your faithfulness. And it will have an effect. And God is moving, even in these quiet times. He did with Joseph. He did with Mary. And as a result of that, He did with all of us. Let's have a worship team come if they would.